And, I would go so far as to say that in terms of a threat to democracy, this is the greatest threat the United States has ever experienced, at least an internal kind of a threat. But, now it's a function of Donald Trump. What in the past was unthinkable now has become part of the mainstream debate. I don't even think that Donald Trump knows what the unitary theory of the presidency is, but he's certainly behaving according to its tenets. Over many, many decades, the president has become the most powerful part of government, and if the unitary theory prevails, he's going to become even more powerful to an extraordinary extent.
Today's guest is Professor Richard Bourne, who's an American political scientist. He studies elections and government, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Because this is a new channel, I hope you subscribe to see more new content and also leave me a comment below, just so I could know what you think of my episodes. I'm really excited for this conversation, primarily because I've always seen American system as such a protectorate of a democratic society and values, and for the first time, I find myself really concerned. I wanted to get your thoughts. Do you think Americans need to be concerned right now?
Well, very definitely. Sometimes you see in the media the term constitutional crisis that's evolving. With regard to Donald Trump and his actions as president, I would go further and I'd say, it's not something that's evolving. It's something that right now is happening. And, I would go so far as to say that in terms of a threat to democracy, this is the greatest threat the United States has ever experienced, at least an internal kind of a threat. So, there's just so many areas out there where Donald Trump has been engaging in actions that the great majority of constitutional scholars and political scientists see as absolutely unconstitutional. But, in terms of what the Constitution actually says, it's up to the Supreme Court. So many of these confrontations, like his firing of civil servants who are supposed to be protected against political firings, they're going to end up before the Supreme Court, almost certainly. And there's really no way of knowing just what the court is going to say. The Supreme Court today, one of the most conservative Supreme Courts in history. And of course, it's 6-3 Republican. And of those 6 members who are Republican, 3 of them were named by Donald Trump. Actually, the 2 most conservative people on the court are not even among the 3 that he named, rather Alito and Thomas. So, constitutional scholars will say, this is clearly unconstitutional, no question whatsoever, but you just never know until ultimately the Supreme Court comes down with its verdict. And, again, if you want to explore the various kinds of threats to the Constitution, I'd be happy to do so.
Yeah, definitely. If you would like to elaborate more on what exactly the threats that we're facing.
Well, as I just said, with regard to firing civil servants, and also firing the heads of some of the independent regulatory agencies out there, can a president do this? The conventional wisdom says no. Civil service protection extends to people who get hired on a merit basis. These are not political appointees. The vast majority of employees in the executive branch are civil servants. And with regard to firing the heads of these various agencies like Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and so forth, the idea is when Congress agreed to set up such organizations, it insisted that these people had to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate. And a president can't just dismiss these people without cause. The people who head the agencies, also people who are just one step below the very head, they have fixed terms of office. And for a president, as Trump has been doing, to take such action, the experts out there in the world of academia say this is clearly violation of what is in the Constitution. But what the Constitution says is up to the Supreme Court, and it's up to the Supreme Court of the particular moment. So I'm not overly optimistic, I think, with regard to how the court is finally going to come down. The worst thing of all with regard to Trump's attempt to restructure so much of the federal government. I mean, everything is extraordinary about Donald Trump, but I think the most extraordinary thing is how he's trying to get rid of the Department of Education. Now
Mm-hmm.
you're talking about a cabinet department. And cabinet departments, I mean, basically, it's in the Constitution. The president can name people to head these cabinet organizations out there. And the person who is the secretary of a cabinet department, confirmed by the Senate. And if Congress creates an organization like the Department of Education, the conventional wisdom says it's up to Congress to decide whether or not to get rid of it. But Trump, I don't know if he's done this yet, but he certainly had been reported to be on the verge of issuing an executive order getting rid of the Department of Education. And, can he do this? I mean, he's not going to get the approval of Congress. No way.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the House would go along with him, with its very narrow, solid Republican majority, or at least extremely solid majority of Republicans. The Senate, however, presumably the filibuster would be used by the Democrats to prevent the Senate getting up to 60 votes to get rid of the thing. But Trump is asserting, he can do whatever he wants to with regard to the organization of the executive branch. And again, in my mind, it is just vehemently anti-constitutional, particularly with regard to a cabinet department. But we'll have to see what happens. He's already issued an executive order, which has resulted in about 50% of the Department of Education being fired, thousands of employees. So that's just one of a whole myriad of, these kinds of actions that he's attempted, so many of them by fiat executive action.
Mm-hmm.
He has issued, I think it's already been issued, another executive order. This is seen as being blatantly unconstitutional, getting rid of birthright citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
The 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868, says anybody who is born on U.S. soil is a U.S. citizen. And, there are really far right-wing constitutional scholars out there, just a bare handful, who say, well, this really doesn't cover people who are illegal immigrants out there. But vast majority of these constitutional scholars out there says, yes, it means exactly what it says. If you're born on U.S. soil, with a handful of exceptions, you become a U.S. citizen at the moment of your birth. So Trump, again, I think he's issued already at least a partial executive order saying no more birthright citizenship. So, I just go on and on and on. And, it's, as I said, this is, I think, the most serious internal threat to democracy in the history of the Republic.
Yeah, I think something that I find especially threatening is making a lot more positions in the government to be political versus neutral. I
Yeah.
think something that Republicans cite in their defense is the Article 2 of the Constitution, which then leads them to cite the unitary executive theory, that given that it is a cabinet position, president has the right to fire and hire as he wishes. What do you know about the unitary executive theory, and how did it develop throughout time, and what do you think about the current interpretation of it?
Well, you go back, let's say 15, 20 years ago, probably the person who's most identified with it is John Woo, very conservative legal scholar, who I think taught at least for a while at Berkeley. But 15, 20 years ago, it was thought to be absolutely fringe crackpot doctrine. Absolutely, the number of people, who supported it were way, way off to the right, and they weren't given very much credibility at all. But, now it's a function of Donald Trump. What in the past was unthinkable now has become part of the mainstream debate.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even think that Donald Trump knows what the unitary theory of the presidency is, but he's certainly behaving according to its tenets. And the idea again, this is really considered to be crackpot, far right-wing extremist nonsense. The idea is that the president is supposed to be absolutely supreme within the executive branch. So that's Article 2 of the Constitution, where it sets up the powers of the president. But, in point of fact, Congress over many, many decades, over the centuries, has imposed some kind of checks on the president, which have been seen as perfectly constitutional. And, one of those checks, referring to what I had said earlier, has to do with setting up an independent regulatory agency or a cabinet department, insisting the top people in those organizations, they've got to be confirmed by the Senate. And for the independent regulatory agencies, they're given fixed terms of service. The president can't just dismiss them without cause. But Donald Trump, he doesn't believe in that. He thinks the president just fire and then rehire political appointees at will. So, that's very much in tune with this unitary theory. Another one of the elements, this has not amounted to a lot yet, but it will. This is really a biggie. When it comes to presidential usurpation of power, Trump and his budget director, the OMB director, Russell Voigt, say that the president actually has the power of impoundment. Impoundment was a real controversy back in the 1970s under Richard Nixon.
Yeah.
And it was thought that that issue had been resolved in favor of Congress. The idea is that president signs an appropriations bill into law. And then what Richard Nixon was doing to an unprecedented extent, previous presidents had been doing it, but not nearly to the same extent. He was saying, well, even though I signed this into law, the appropriations bill, I don't have to spend the money ever. So, he was impounding hundreds of millions of dollars. He said he was doing this in the name of fiscal responsibility to hold down the deficit. But the reality is he was trying to change priorities. He didn't want to spend so much money on things like cleaning up waterways and cleaning up the air and so forth. So, this really struck at the heart of congressional power. The most important power of Congress is the power to tax and spend. So what Congress did in 1974 was to pass Budget and Impoundment Control Act, which is kind of complicated, but essentially it says the president cannot impound money any longer without getting the consent of Congress. Congress made it really, really tough for that consent to be issued. So that, has been considered essentially settled law ever since 74.
So by the law, if a president wanted to impact the spending, what would be the legal procedure?
Well, just do it, and then Congress will obviously file a lawsuit. It's going to reach the Supreme Court. This is at the heart of Congress versus president when it comes to power. And, here's another one of those matters where you just can't say how it's going to end up. A person like Russell Voigt, who's extremely right-wing, he and other people who used to be regarded as fringe right-wingers, they insisted that the impoundment part of the Budget and Impoundment Control Act was unconstitutional. But to my knowledge, it's never been challenged until right now. And, Trump certainly, he hasn't come out and said flatly he's going to impound money, but he's certainly given every indication he'll do so. And Voigt, no question whatsoever, Russell Voigt, he's gone on the record many, many times as saying, he thinks that the law is unconstitutional. So there's going to be some kind of a confrontation where Trump, flatly, right in the face of Congress, I'm not going to spend that money. And then, the inevitable lawsuit that'll reach the Supreme Court. So that's another one of these elements, is very much related to the idea of a unitary presidency. If you believe in the unitary presidency doctrine, what that means essentially is that Congress only has two ways to check a president, and neither one is viable. But way number one would be you don't appropriate money that the president wants. And then number two would be impeachment, impeachment by the House followed by removal, known as conviction, by the Senate. And, the impeachment process, it's never going to work. Absolutely not, particularly when you have a Republican Congress. So, this unitary theory of the presidency, it's become the case over many, many decades. The president has become the most powerful part of government. And if the unitary theory prevails, he's going to become even more powerful to an extraordinary extent.
Going back to the ability of the president to fire agency employees, Are you familiar with the Humphreys Executor versus United States lawsuit of 1935, where the court overruled the case? FDR wanted to fire William Humphrey, but it's seen as one of the main cases that we're going to come back to in this current presidency. And there are speculations that it could be overruled, and president is going to receive more power in being able to fire and hire.
Yeah, that's the idea, civil service. Civil service employees are supposed to be mirrored employees, and they're not subjected to political kinds of actions on the part of the president. I'm not familiar with the intricacies of this case, but that's the general idea. And I mean, you know how it came to pass that civil service employees came to dominate in the executive branch? The original story of how this happened, the cliche, to the victor belongs the spoils. And this more or less originated with Andrew Jackson's presidency. A president would come into office. They'd do a whole-scale house cleaning, kicking out the people who had been named as political appointees by the predecessor and naming his own political loyalists to the job. And then in return, you got named as a political appointee. You were expected to kick in to the president, campaign for reelection, to his party as well, a certain percentage of your salary. And I mean, it's obvious that that kind of a system is absolutely ripe for vast corruption. So the corruption, sensitivity to the corruption emerged in the latter part of the 1800s. And then what brought things to a head, what finally tilted the balance in favor of going to civil service, was the assassination of James Garfield, who was a Republican president, like halfway through his first year in office. So-called disappointed job seeker who thought he'd been promised a high-ranking job and the administration didn't get it. So he blamed Garfield for his misfortune, and he assassinated Garfield. So that then led the successor, Chester Arthur, new president, who took over to support civil service reform. It wasn't Arthur that was the originator of this. It's rather, he went along with the growing reform movement. So, the idea is you get hired on a merit basis. You have to pass a civil service exam in most cases, or at least in many cases, and that gives you job protection. I mean, not 100%. You can always be fired for malfeasance in office, for corruption, incompetency, and so forth. But you have to be fired if you're going to be fired for cause. So, I mean, this was a major reform out there, and Donald Trump is taking the attitude in line with unitary theory. I can do what I want by way of hiring and firing. And, with regard to the hiring, where he has named political appointees, there are roughly 4,000 political appointments that a president is allowed. And, above all else, this is a cliche. He values loyalty to himself and absolutely nothing else. So it's not simply, replacing these fired civil servants with those of a conservative mentality with Republicans. It's rather people who are going to click their heels and do my bidding.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, I mean, these things just mount over and over and over again, the kind of dangers that we're facing.
One of the other things that are concerning in terms of the amount of people that Trump has almost direct power over, he issued another executive order where he believes that independent agencies should all be under the control of the executive branch and ultimately become all cabinet agencies.
Yeah, under the control of the president. Yeah.
Is that constitutional? And why do we have cabinet agencies? And then why do we have independent agencies?
Well, the history of these independent agencies, basically they emerged because government was getting more and more complicated, getting involved with more and more policy matters. So, just having the standard cabinet departments was not enough. The number of cabinet departments gradually has risen over time to the present number of 15. But, so many other areas out there. Basically, what you needed was regulatory agencies that would interpret the laws that Congress had written. And also the idea, I mean, this was basically a democratic innovation, that their interpretation, they would side with the public against powerful interests like businesses. So you start seeing some movement in this direction under Woodrow Wilson, who was, a progressive president. You could view Wilson as being a kind of precursor then to Franklin Roosevelt. Then Roosevelt, with regard to the regulatory state, took things, up to an entirely new level out there. So over and over and over again, you have these laws of Congress. And Congress, there's no way in which it can write in details as to how the law is going to be interpreted. That would make for laws that took on, like hundreds upon hundreds of pages. So basically, Congress passes an outline of what it intends, and then it's up to the regulatory agency to actually interpret in a specific kind of a situation. Now that's being challenged right now. I mean, this is an independent kind of venue. I mean, obviously, Trump wants to gain control over these regulatory commissions and make the decisions as to what they put forth. But the Supreme Court, even before Trump took over for his second term, John Roberts, Chief Justice, he is very much an activist when it comes to weakening the regulatory commissions. And there have been a number of decisions now which have watered down, at minimum, you can say watered down the power of these independent agencies to interpret the law. If this goes any further, what the implication is going to be, Congress will have to put in more details on the laws that it writes, rather than leaving it up to the agencies to interpret. And if not, I mean, this is almost impossible for Congress to do. It's so busy with other things. If not, then it'll be up to the judges, federal judges, to interpret, in a particular case, what the law actually says. And, I mean, federal judges are not very qualified to do this, and there aren't enough of them. And, it'd be a monumental increase in their workload. So you see, that's where things stand from the standpoint of the Supreme Court. But, the independent regulatory agencies, there are tens upon tens of them, and they're considered a mainstay of the existing executive branch. And it's very difficult to conceive of an executive branch functioning without having these independent organizations out there. They're not supposed to be susceptible to direct presidential control. The president controls them only in the sense that he can nominate, the very top officials, and that's it. I mean, any kind of attempt to intervene in decisions they make would be viewed as a violation of the law.
What is the law that protects these independent agencies from presidential influence?
Again, I'm not a legal scholar, but I would cite something called Chevron deference. Chevron deference, I can't tell you the name of the case, but the Chevron Oil Company was involved in this. This goes back to 1984. And Chevron deference basically said, that regulatory commissions have this kind of authority to interpret the law. The word deference means, this was not a part of the name of the case, but it's the idea that ever since 1984, because precedent was set, Supreme Courts are supposed to defer to that decision and, give a lot of running room, a lot of deference, grant a lot of deference to the independent regulatory commission decisions. And, now, as a result of John Roberts' mentality and the Supreme Court in general, there have been a number of decisions that have weakened Chevron deference. In fact, there's a recent decision, I can't put my finger on the name of it, very recent one, which seems to have overturned Chevron deference. A decision of, I think, last year, but again, I can't remember the name. But again, it's not definitive yet. But that's where the Supreme Court has certainly been moving.
What would be the implications of these independent agencies coming into a more direct influence of the president?
Well, if you ever, moving ahead, if Congress, both houses were to become Democratic, let's say this is kind of Fantasyville. It's not going to happen as a result of the 2026 election. The House has a good chance of going Democratic, but the Senate, small chance only. If you have Democrats then passing laws out there, and the independent regulatory commission, some of them still have Democrats who are heading them. Donald Trump with regard to the interpretation of what the laws are saying. He
Mhm.
overrides the decisions that these civil servants are making and interprets the law in his own favor. With the Justice Department advisors advising him over his shoulder. So that could be one of the implications. But interpretation of the law is, extremely, extremely important. Again, because these laws, they're really, really dealing with complicated kinds of things, and Congress just doesn't have the time, the inclination, the expertise to put in all of those details. So how you interpret what Congress actually means, really important. And Trump would love to be in a situation with a Democratic Congress where he could order people in the regulatory agencies to interpret it according to his own views.
That makes sense. I think one last thing I wanted to bring up, I think in terms of like one of the most concerning things that I see
Mhm.
happening is president's ability to label things as emergency or even like a terrorist threat. For example, what we've seen with the border emergency to draw more budget towards building the wall, or
Yeah.
something that's more recent where Trump announced that it's a terrorist act, what's happening to the Tesla showrooms. Is that is there any legal protections around president being able to do that?
Well, I mean, to some extent, presidents have more emergency powers as a consequence of 9/11, of course. And when Congress agreed to do this very, very bipartisan kind of a fashion, it never envisioned the extent to which Donald Trump was going to take advantage. It's another one of these legal ambiguities. I mean, is there really an emergency on the border, which allows Trump, among other things, to send something like 10,000 American troops down there?
Mm-hmm.
Objectively, no. The flow of illegal immigrants into the United States, even before Trump was inaugurated, very, very much diminished. And the troops that are down there, I mean, they're bored as hell because they don't have as much of anything to do. But still, in terms of that's an interpretation of the law. The emergency X or Y or Z gives the president a free hand. What you said about Tesla showrooms, now that I had not been familiar with. It issued an executive order saying this was an emergency because a handful of these Tesla showrooms, are being firebombed and windows broken and so forth.
There's definitely a statement. I don't know if there's been an executive order yet, but he made a statement that's something that he's going to do. And then I read some commentary around it is that, first of all, that affects the way law enforcement happens, the local police versus whether there's going to be military or federal law enforcement involved. And then also, if I comment something that's not condemning what's happening to Tesla showrooms, am I now supporting terrorism, or what would be the interpretation of that?
Well, yeah, again, this is something that I'm totally unfamiliar with. To say it's ridiculous is a grotesque understatement. And this is not exactly a threat to Tesla's bottom line. It's been happening in a minority of situations. Uh, Something to worry about more has to do with restrictions on freedom of speech, which you were kind of touching on in your comment there. Supporting, endorsing breaking of Tesla showroom windows. Could that get you deported if you were a green card holder? Total idiocy. And yet, you can't say entirely that it'll not happen. What has been playing out, I mean, this among, the whole plethora of these kinds of threats to democracy. The Columbia University student, who's under detention, he's a green card holder, which means, he can stay in the United States as long as he wants. Green card holders basically have the same constitutional rights as U.S. citizens. And the guy, he didn't do anything illegal. He was supporting the cause of the Gazans against Israel. He was an activist at Columbia. And, they just apprehend him. They seize the guy. His wife is pregnant, and he's now supposedly being detained somewhere in Louisiana. And there's just no way of knowing how in the end that's going to end up. But I mean, boy, even though it's like one case with regard to violation of freedom of speech, even though he's not a U.S. citizen, I mean, this is extraordinarily disturbing.
Hmm.
And if he can get away with this, Trump, with having this guy thrown out of the country, then where's it going to stop? I don't understand. I mean, all of the legalities that are involved here, but I know it was played up yesterday. Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, supposedly has kind of like unilateral authority to decide whether or not this poor guy gets thrown out of the country. And
Oh,
you know,
wow.
from Marco Rubio's standpoint, he's not in the past been an ultra Trump loyalist, but as a way of showing to Trump that he is a loyalist, he can be trusted. He might very much be tempted to go in the direction of expulsion. But
Was he
supporting the cause of breaking Tesla showroom windows, well, yeah, that's something else.
was the guy detained after, or was he protesting after the executive order about the campus protest was passed, or was
No, because he had been an activist with regard to very soon after October the 6th, or October
Mhm.
7th rather. So I imagine for middle of October onwards, for many many months, he was leader of Columbia demonstrations well before Donald Trump became president. But Trump has said, I mean, he said flatly, for what it's worth, that people who are not U.S. citizens and who are supporting the cause of terrorism, and this guy wasn't supporting terrorism. I mean, he was supporting Gaza against the Israeli attacks, that they're going to be thrown out of the country.
So if the executive order that made these campus protests illegal was passed in January or February, for example, is it is there any legal grounds to sort of punish somebody for actions they performed before such law was passed?
Well, I guess, Trump's interpretation would be it's continuing. He may not be actively leading demonstrations, but still he's, siding with the cause of the Hamas terrorists.
Hmm.
In terms of, the legality, the timing of it, I really can't comment on that.
Hmm.
But I mean, basically what Trump has said publicly, if you support terrorism, and Trump defines what terrorism is, and you're not a U.S. citizen, I will throw you out of the country.
Yeah.
And again, my understanding is that those who are green card holders, basically have the same constitutional rights as U.S. citizens, including First Amendment rights to speak up as they see fit.
Hmm. Yeah.
So, I mean, it's not, I mean, mainly it's not because Donald Trump wants to kick these people out of the country. Only a limited number would be actually expelled. It's rather to suppress opposition to Trump policies and put a lid on that, and certainly from the standpoint of university administrators to take a tougher line where these demonstrations have taken place. I mean, already you're starting to see some of that. Universities are getting very, very frightened because they're so dependent, the big research universities at least, on federal funding. So it's not like I'm going to close you down or anything. It's rather the threat of cutting off money. Columbia University right now, $400 million in federal funding is, I guess the proper term to use is suspended. It's not finalized. And at least in theory, Columbia, by acceding to some of the administration demands, maybe can get back its money. But $400 million, even for an enormously well-endowed place like Columbia, is a tremendous, tremendous bite.
Yeah.
And so again, suppression of these protests where Trump is in a disagreement, politically speaking, and getting the university administrators to clamp down. There's supposed to be, I think, 60 different universities and colleges in the United States that currently are under investigation for alleged anti-Semitism, not supporting their Jewish students sufficiently.
Hmm.
And I mean, this is an enormous number, 60 different colleges and universities. And, there too, this kind of suppression, the shot across the bow, the warning. And, in so many of those cases, protesting against what Israel has done in Gaza, interpreting that as being anti-Semitism. Well, some of it is, but most of it is not.
Yeah. I think another concern with him being able to um, label things more dramatically as they are is that that allows for more federal law enforcement versus local law enforcement. How much does this extend presidential control over society if situations are reserved either by the military or other agencies of federal law enforcement versus local law enforcement?
Well, setting a precedent, ICE in particular, ICE going into sanctuary cities like Chicago, and in some cases, having a direct confrontation with the local police.
Mhm.
Uh, ICE is saying it has the right even to enter into schools and to apprehend illegal immigrants, or even with regard to churches. So, somewhere down the line, it's likely you're going to see a real confrontation there between the local officials in these liberal democratic cities and the feds coming in. And, you have to think almost everything out there by way of a controversy in the world of government finally comes down to a Supreme Court decision.
Mhm.
But the problem is, for the Supreme Court to finally take up the case and issue its decision, it's going to take a long, long time. And over the interim, you can get some restraining orders from local federal judges, maybe, but maybe not. Basically speaking, the government is probably going to get its way until there's a final legal determination. Among other things, it goes on and on and on. The Trump administration is saying that these local judges, liberal judges, who've issued various restraining orders, you can't fire, these employees of this organization in the government or that organization. The Trump administration is taking the view that this is illegal, that you can't have a local federal judge who issues a decision that is to be implemented on a national basis. At most, it should only be implemented with regard to the jurisdiction of that particular district judge. So that's another one of these legal controversies that's arisen. And, Trump, unitary theory of the presidency, absolute control over the Justice Department. So he's getting a Justice Department to do his bidding on almost everything out there. He's named ultra loyalists to the top positions,
Mhm.
including at least a couple of his former lawyers that were defending him in court last year. The precedent is that the Justice Department is semi-autonomous. It has to be because of the vast power that it's able to exercise. But basically, Trump has made the Justice Department into, part of the White House office. The White House office, these are people who are not confirmed by the Senate. These are the presidential loyalists, the intimates, like chief of staff and so forth. And that's essentially what he's made the Justice Department into, part not a cabinet, semi-autonomous cabinet department, but part of the White House office, which he directly controls.
Mhm.
Over and over and over again, these precedents of the past, so many of which anybody who studied the presidency thought were settled law, they're not settled law. No, absolutely not. Nothing is settled under the Trump administration until finally, you get a Supreme Court decision, and who knows how long that's going to take.
Yeah. What's been the previous precedent in terms of district courts and local courts ruling decisions that are concerning the whole nation, where they're previously accepted sort of across the whole country?
Well, that's the status quo. Obviously, then what you do, you appeal upwards to an appellate court.
Mm-hmm.
And the appellate court, certainly in a number of cases, is going to overturn what the district judge said. And then you get bumped all the way up to the Supreme Court. But we're not simply talking about a bunch of liberal district court judges issuing, these kinds of restraints against the Trump administration. I can't remember the name of this district court judge in Texas who's extraordinarily right-wing and extraordinarily anti-abortion. The anti-abortion forces in the United States filed a case in his particular jurisdiction because they knew what this guy's mentality was on abortion rights. And, this guy issues a decision essentially saying that the pill, the abortion pill, RU486, mifepristone, I think, I can't pronounce that very well. Basically, what he said in his decision is that you can't distribute the pill any longer because he made the argument the FDA had not adequately tested it out. It wasn't safe, which is total nonsense. The abortion pill is about as safe a medication as you can find anywhere. So again, this ultra right-wing judge, just one judge in a very, very conservative area of Texas, he issued this decision, which was supposed to have national implications, but immediately got appealed upwards to a appellate court. The appellate court then watered it down somewhat, not entirely, and then finally the Supreme Court last year said, I think something like the people who filed the lawsuit didn't have standing. So, the decision went down the tubes. When you don't really want to make a decision on something like that, you say the people who file a lawsuit don't have legal standing. It's a way of punting. So, that's what you do when there's but then again, your precedent is that the district court judges can and have issued decisions that have national implications. It's not the final word on it.
What can you say about the pushback that we've seen so far to preserve more the status quo and limit some of the power grab that Trump is attempting? I think it primarily came from courts, but if you could talk about both legislative branch pushback and the courts.
Well, legislative branch pushback right now, the Democrats are at a low point. It's gotten worse and worse since the election day. They're still in a state of shock. The trauma has definitely not been overcome. And, frankly, they don't know what to do. To the extent that they have been doing something, they're embarrassing themselves. It gets worse almost by the day. Obviously, what happens following an election defeat, you have a division with regard to the ideological parts of the party. The progressives say, we lost because Harris wasn't sufficiently off to the left. She wasn't sufficiently progressive, and then vice versa with regard to the more moderate forces in the Democratic Party. So these recriminations, and they go on and on and on. The party is very divided. With regard to today, where the Senate is very likely to go ahead and approve the Republican action to basically extend existing spending until the start of the new fiscal year, half year down, but with some modifications cutting back on spending out there. Schumer embarrassed himself grotesquely. This is just one of many, many examples out there where the Democrats can't get their act together and they keep putting their foot in their mouth. So Schumer, yesterday was saying, we're going to oppose this continuation of spending. We have our own plan. And then he reversed himself within a matter of hours. So now, on the part of the more liberal forces in the Democratic Party in the Senate and elsewhere, they're extremely angry at Schumer for selling out the Democratic Party. So again, this debate goes on and on and on. One part of the Democratic Party, I think the part that offends me to the greatest extent, is the part, these are people typically on the left who seem to think politics is performance art. Somehow by performing out there in colorful ways, they're going to mobilize the public against Trump, which I think is ridiculous. It's self-destructive. There's no better example of that than what some of these very liberal Democrats did during Trump's address to a joint session of Congress last Tuesday, 2 Tuesdays ago. Again, that I think was the very low point of the Democratic Party so far. Hakeem Jeffries, who is the Democratic leader in the House, he didn't try in any kind of a serious way to restrain these people. He said, you should be polite and so forth. But then when the performance art erupted, he didn't criticize them. He just basically, let it stand. You had Democrats out there, like 10 or 12 of them, they walked out during the address. And they took off their coat as they were exiting the floor. And underneath there was a T-shirt that said, resist. Yes, that's a really great way of standing up to Donald Trump. Resist. They had their little paddles, holding that up with various slogans, sloganeering. A lot of them were hissing and booing as Trump went on in his address. Early in the Obama administration, when he gave a speech to a joint session of Congress, this was a very memorable moment. Somebody shouted, at first they couldn't tell who it was. It was Joe Wilson, a Republican from South Carolina, who shouted at Obama, "You lie." And it took them a while to find out who that person was, who the culprit was. And then when they discovered it was a Republican, Joe Wilson, the Republican leadership made him apologize. So that says something, back in the old days. But now these kinds of actions took place. And Hakeem Jeffries, he didn't approve of it, but he let it be. And the worst thing of all, which I find to be extremely offensive, this now is Al Green of Texas. From the very beginning of Trump's speech, Green stood up and he waved his cane in the air. And he was saying, "You don't have a mandate. You don't have a mandate. You don't have a mandate," really, really loudly. He was being extremely disruptive. So twice he got warned by Mike Johnson, the speaker, "You're in danger of being thrown out." He refused to adhere to what Johnson was saying. Then the third time, that wasn't a warning. That was actually ordering Sergeant of Arms to escort Green out of the chamber. And as he was being escorted, he kept yelling and yelling, "You don't have a mandate. You don't have a mandate." And, he didn't get criticized by Hakeem Jeffries. And then, if it could be imagined that it would get worse, it did the next day because he got censored. Censor doesn't have any kind of physical punishment. You have to stand in the well of the House. And then the speaker reads off the censure resolution. So, there he is, Al Green, and the resolution is being read off. And something like 10 or 12 of the very, very left-wing Democrats, they surround Green and they start singing, "We Shall Overcome," which I just found to be, really, really grotesque. I mean, they're singing the civil rights anthem as if what Al Green was doing was, on behalf of a sacred cause. I mean, he was being obnoxious and disruptive. And this is just really, really demeaning, to civil rights in general and, to the whole cause of the Democratic Party against Trump. So, almost everybody who's commented on what happened during the address of 2 Tuesdays ago, has been very critical, deservedly, towards the Democrats. So they can't get their act together. And what does it mean to get their act together? I'm fairly cynical on this, as you might sense. The election of 2026, the midterms, that's a long way off, more than a year and a half from now. But if the Democrats can win control of the House, which they have a decent chance of actually achieving, one house of Congress, well, that shuts down, at least legislatively, Donald Trump. It would be a repeat of what happened in 2019 when the Democrats regained control of the House. So at least from that standpoint, Democrats are going to have big victory of a negative sense of saying Trump cannot do. And they also can start launching investigations. They can't do this on their own now under Republican control. But at least the House can start using its investigatory authority. The Senate is hopeless, or almost hopeless. They're not going to win control of the Senate. But still, if you just win the House, even by a narrow margin, the rule of thumb is that a majority rules in the House, no matter how small it is. So survive for a little bit more than a year and a half, and that's the best I think they can come up with.
You don't have any hopes for finding, I guess, a few Republicans that are tired of Trump's policies and behavior that would join with Democrats?
Well, over and over again, there have been reports. This goes back to the first term in office of Trump that, there were a relatively small number of Republicans who were absolutely sickened by him. But they didn't speak up, and even less of a temptation now to do that. There are fewer of these people, in the current House than there were back in his first term. The impeachment number 2 of Donald Trump, which took place in the in January of 2021, we had a total of 10 Republicans, who voted to impeach at very, very considerable risk to themselves. And what happened to those 10? It's just really nauseating because there are only two that remain in Congress. Any fear that they had about what could happen to them by resisting, was confirmed by what followed.
What
Uh,
happened to
four
them?
four of the 10, again, there were 10 who voted to impeach in January of 2021. This was the impeachment that had to do with the insurrection of January 6th. So four of them were primaried to death, by a more extreme right winger that was backed by Trump. Liz Cheney is the best example in Wyoming. She lost her renomination battle by an extraordinarily large margin. It was pathetic.
Mm-hmm.
Trump supported her opponent. And it's not only that four of them were actually defeated in primaries. Being defeated in a primary is not a common occurrence. Four others didn't even decide to try for re-election because in good part, they anticipated what would happen. They'd be primaried and possibly they would lose. So
Mm-hmm.
that left two out of the 10 surviving. And, those two are still there in Congress. But when only two out of 10, are around a relatively short time afterwards, that says something. But, the stories persist that Republicans, there is a minority out there. And, they're absolutely appalled. They're sickened by Donald Trump. But they don't have a spine. I mean, electorally, there's nothing more important than coming back to Congress. And
Mm-hmm.
they're just not willing to stick their neck out because they've seen what's happened to those who have. So the Republican Party, I mean, it's not just that they're afraid of, from their own standpoint, but they think they're exaggerating the extent to which Trump is popular, the extent to which, he has a mandate. He doesn't have a mandate. He won narrowly in the popular vote in 2024. But still,
Mm-hmm.
some of them think it's just good for the whole party. This is the new party. It's Donald Trump. And they may have lots of reservations about him, about MAGA republicanism, but who am I to stand in the way of a new, strong Republican majority? I think, though, the first of these reasons for their cowardice is more important. They're looking out after their own reelection in the future, their own renomination in the future.
Mm-hmm. Professor,
So
I thought.
again, Congress under Republican control. The caveat is that Trump's policies so far, have gone way, way beyond anything that people anticipated in the election. And when he does things, like cut back on Social Security staff, the tariffs, et cetera, people didn't envision how far to the extreme he was going to go. And, assuming that these actions of his, extremist actions, cause real hardship economically for the American public. Tariffs in particular, not decreasing inflation, which is what Americans wanted more than anything else, as a consequence of their voting behavior in 2024. But tariffs, if they increase inflation, well, there can be a turning on Donald Trump rather quickly in the public. And
Mm-hmm.
then these guys in the Republican Party in the House, just from the standpoint of their own welfare, then they can start moving against him. And, that very well could happen. Some of it did happen in 2018. Donald Trump on social issues moving way off to the right, anti-abortion rights and so forth. And that's a good explanation for why the Republicans lost so many seats in the House in the 2018 midterms, how the Democrats, gained control of the House. So some of the same kind of behavior can take place on the part of the electorate for the next midterm, 2026.
I think
Uh,
that's the hope.
well, again, some of it's very early. That's the thing. I mean, Donald Trump has not even been president for 2 months, but there are some poll findings out there. Americans do not support tariffs, and this idea tariffs are the magic answer to what ails us economically. We can reduce taxes and tariffs, more than an economic boom, just leading us into an economic golden age and so forth. Americans, they don't know very much about what tariffs are, but they're suspicious of this notion. So in some specific actions, birthright citizenship being taken away, there too, they don't approve of Trump. That's not as important, though, as the tariff issue, as economic issues. So a few signs out there, and again, it's early, but so many economists, think really this is going to trigger the tariff thing, very, very, very serious inflation, which is entirely counterproductive with regard to the most important reason why Trump was elected in the first place in 2024. More than anything else, it was inflation that did in the Democrats. And some of these guys, it really gets me, in the Trump administration. I mean, they're coming forth and they're saying, well, maybe we're going to get into a recession. And it's a temporary thing. That's all. Just recession. Yeah, right. And Trump himself has hinted, well, maybe a recession is going to take place. You have some of these guys who say, well, inflation, okay, so tariffs may cause inflation, but over the long haul, we're going to be better off. But Americans don't make calculations on the basis of the long haul. It's the here and now. So there is that possibility again, even before the midterm election, the corrective possibility in the 2026 midterms. American public opinion will turn against Trump. Trump, though, he can't sink down into the 20% approval area because that goes too far. He's got too many loyalists out there. But he could easily enough, job approval wise, sink down to somewhere in the mid 30s, let's say. Definitely a possibility. He's now in the high 40s, which isn't terribly good for a starting president. So at that point, Republicans might be a little bit less in the way of obedient. Yeah, that's fine.
One last subject I wanted to briefly touch on in terms of checks and balances. What have we seen from the courts so far, and what can we expect going forward?
Well, the history of Supreme Court decisions when it comes to presidential power, the Supreme Court, the bottom line, does not want to intervene in such cases on a lot of occasions. I mean, this is a really politically fraught kind of an arena out there, but sometimes the court has no discretion and it's got to make a decision. So the rule of thumb is that historically the court sides with the president. I mean, sometimes to the point where it's been, well, according to most legal scholars, obviously anti-constitutional decision. World War II, with regard to the Supreme Court siding with Franklin Roosevelt, his detention of Japanese Americans, putting them behind barbed wire. So there were two of these decisions the Supreme Court made, Korematsu and then Hirabayashi, companion cases, which ruled in favor of Roosevelt, even though the majority of these Japanese Americans that were being interred were full-fledged American citizens. You don't second guess a president in a time of war was basically the way the court came down. So, you add this on with regard to the numerous cases that are going to be hitting the Supreme Court over the next year or two. 6-3 Republican majority, 3 of them named by Donald Trump himself, plus the history of Supreme Court deference to presidents. In terms of, I think, just about one of the worst Supreme Court decisions in history, literally, which was of this nature, last year's immunity decision for Donald Trump. This was Trump versus United States. And I mean, this is really a horrendous decision, which in terms of ramifications, it's very difficult to see where it's all going to end. But, it had to do with the matter of whether you can prosecute on the basis of criminal charges a president for something that he did while he was serving in office. The precedent for decades of the Justice Department is you do not prosecute a president while he is still in office. But then, what was left up in the air was whether or not you can do this after the president leaves office. You go back to Richard Nixon and the Watergate offenses that he committed. I mean, it was certainly thought to be absolutely proper that after being forced out of the White House, he could be prosecuted for a variety of Watergate sins. And so Gerald Ford, issued like 1 month into his presidency, a blanket pardon to safeguard him from being brought to trial. So, that was the way in which law had been interpreted. But this time around, in the Trump versus U.S. case, the Supreme Court said, on one hand, that anything that a president does in office that can be construed as fulfillment of presidential obligations as set forth in the Constitution, you cannot prosecute a president after he leaves office on that basis. It said on the other side of things, something that's a purely personal kind of action on the part of a president. He is susceptible to prosecution, but then there's this vast middle ground, and nobody knows, where the meter is going to end up in the middle ground. What the court did is it said to the appellate court that referred the case upwards to the Supreme Court, set the boundary, set the limit, just what is personal and what is in the context of official fulfillment of presidential power. So the appellate court is yet to come forth with its decision. But there is a very, very strong school of thought that says that in the end, there's going to be a tremendous amount of deference in terms of interpreting what's an official act. That in reality, things that are personal political protection, the president will be deemed immune from being prosecuted on that basis. And, with good lawyers, he's had some very good lawyers out there defending him, paid for public, tremendous number of contributions to his legal defense team last year. And these people, start thinking about like ordering the FBI to wiretap the phones of your political opponents. That was what Richard Nixon did, part of his Watergate offenses, which was clearly seen as being a violation of law. But, your lawyers can always argue it was in the interest of national defense. These people whose phones were being tapped out there, are being suspected of one way or the other, consorting with the enemy. Just anything can be claimed, and who knows how the Supreme Court is going to come down. So again, this immunity decision with regard to, it's not really part of the doctrine of presidential supremacy with control over the executive branch itself. It's not part of, the unitary theory of the presidency. It's rather with regard to another branch of government, the Supreme Court, the extent to which that part of government can control the president. And, yet it fits under the general heading of presidential vast expansion of power.
Moving on to another subject, I think ever since really World War II, we've seen a growing polarization in the American society. I was wondering, why did we come to such an extreme polarization today? And is there any realistic way to turn it around?
Polarization, I'd say, roughly speaking, various scholars, so many scholars have dealt with it. Tons of books and articles have been written on the subject. And maybe 15 different causes of polarization roughly have been identified. So what that means is, of course, if you could somehow correct 1, 2, 3 of these causes, it's not going to do a lot of good. One of the originating factors goes back to like the late 60s and the 1970s with regard to members of Congress. People who were relatively extreme on policy, very liberal Democrats, they started to run for Congress in greater numbers. They were activists. What made them run for Congress was the two great issues of the day, civil rights and then the Vietnam War. So you start seeing these young activists being elected, moving the Democrats in Congress to the left. And then a little bit later, like middle 1970s up to the late 1970s, then the reaction on the other side, the Republican young activists started running for Congress and winning. In part, it's because of a reaction to the Democrats moving to the left, but in part, it's Ronald Reagan, who was the most formative Republican figure in that era. Reagan ran for the nomination against Gerald Ford in 1976 and came extremely close to defeating him. Pretty extraordinary when it comes to defeating an incumbent for renomination. So, that activated these people even more, and they started to run and get elected as well. So you had young activists on the left and on the right. The kind of people who were more common in the old days, like the 50s, the first part of the 60s, these are individuals, who weren't so active. It wasn't issues that so much made them run for Congress. Material rewards, nice salary, prestige of the job. And those kinds of people, are not likely to move outwards to the left or the right. So Congress changes in that regard, polarized. Regional realignment is a very, very important issue behind polarization. The South realigning towards the Republicans. decade after decade after decade following the Reconstruction period in the late 60s and the 1970s, Democrats were traditional. They would pass on their partisanship to their offspring. And then the offspring, when they grew up and had children, they'd pass on Democratic identity to their children. And so it went generational transmission across the decades. But that, at some point, there's going to be a breaking point. And basically, the breaking point was the 1960s. Civil rights, when the Democrats started moving in the pro-civil rights direction under Lyndon Johnson. So considerable numbers of these white Southerners who'd been traditional Democrats, they couldn't take it any longer. Instead, they moved Republican in presidential voting. The last time, with one exception, that the Democrats won a majority of Southern seats in presidential elections was 1964. That's ancient history. 68, they only won one Southern seat, which was Texas, when Humphrey was the candidate. The exception was 76 when the Democrats swept the South. But, that was a function of Jimmy Carter of Georgia being the candidate, a home-raised Southern boy. Yeah. And then after 1976, that was it. Democrats never have won a majority of the Southern seats at the presidential level. With regard to the congressional level realignment, it was the election of 94, where for the first time since Reconstruction, a majority of Southern House seats and Senate seats became Republican. It takes a while longer for issues to start making an important difference in how you vote when you vote for Congress versus president. And that's it. I mean, basically after 1994, it's been 30 years now of a pretty solid Republican South. House and Senate, it's gotten worse over time. The Republicans now actually in the House, with regard to, I always considered there to be 13 Southern states. So in the House, the Republicans have 71% of those Southern seats, and they have about 85% of the Senate seats from the South. Those are overwhelming majorities. So, the point of this is that the South has been lost to the Democrats. Basically speaking, Southerners in the rank and file population and in Congress, they were the moderating force in the past. Southerners are basically moderate, except civil rights where they weren't moderate. They're gone, and that moderating force is out the door for the Democrats. Realignment in New England and some of the other northeastern states has been in the other direction, where you have some of these rock-ribbed traditional Republicans, moderate Republicans, who, like in the 1980s and 90s, they're repelled by the growing conservatism on social issues of the Republican Party, like on abortion rights. So they start moving Democratic. So, this was, to a more modest extent than was the case with the South, this was a moderating force in the Republican Party, which is now gone. The most phenomenal statistic with regard to New England is that today there's not a single Republican from a New England state in the House. It's like you got 12, you got 6 New England states, and you have a total of 21 House members from those 6 New England states, and every single one of the 21 is a Democrat right now. At the Senate level, you only got 1 Republican from 12 total senators, who's Sue Collins of Maine. So, a moderating force in the Republican Party now is basically gone, and, that's important. Primaries. Almost all political scientists think the primary system for nomination has encouraged polarization. Kind of people, who are going to participate in a primary, they're going to be relatively small in number compared with the general election electorate. Roughly primary turnout is half that in the general election. People who participate in primaries, they're more intense by definition, and intensity goes hand in hand with extremity. So, more extreme Democrats and more extreme Republicans nominating more extreme people as their party's nominee, and usually speaking, getting them actually elected to Congress. In the old days, this tendency for those who were showing up in primaries to be more extremist on policy was not so pronounced. And then I could go on, 15 or so of these factors, which I'm sure you'd never stand for a moment. But I will conclude by saying outside campaign spending is important. More and more, where the money comes from, it's from the super PACs and 501c4s. Without going into the details, both of these kind of organizations have been energized, or in in the case of super PACs, actually come into creation because of the Supreme Court's very important Citizens United versus versus FEC, Citizens United versus FEC in 2010. Super PACs and 501c4s, they can raise as much money as they are able to from anything, any entity, or any individual. And then they can spend unlimited amounts of money on behalf of candidates for federal office. They can't give directly to a candidate, but they can spend on behalf of the candidate as much as they want. And the difference now between independent spending and the spending by a candidate's own campaign organization, more and more that difference is become trivial. Pretty much the commercials that both of these entities run are very, very similar in effectiveness and so forth. The thing about the super PACs and the 501c4s is that they tend to be extremists on the left or the right. So, it's obvious. You're running in an open seat election for the House, and if you want money to be spent on your behalf, you better toe the line with regard to the ideological views of those entities. If you get elected to Congress, you better toe the line with regard to roll call voting, or else they're not going to give you any kind of money on your behalf the next time around, or maybe they'll back a more extremist primary challenger. So, I just cut off at that point with regard to causes, even though there are lots and lots of others out there. But what I would add, and this is really, among a myriad of disturbing developments, this is maybe the most disturbing of all. Ideological polarization is the way in which polarization starts off on issues. But see, over time, what's happened is more and more we're now in the world of what is referred to as affective polarization, affective with an A. In other words, emotional polarization, polarization based upon feeling, based upon sort of identity politics. Your partisanship now is like a social identity, like your religion. Sometimes it gets referred to as tribalism because the metaphor, ancient tribes trying to kill one another, maybe they don't even understand why that started. That was, hundreds of years in the past, but it doesn't matter. It's just us versus them, we good, you bad. So when you get this affective polarization, the possibility of violence, which we have already seen in a number of really disturbing cases, that becomes pretty ominous. And January the 6th, 2021 is maybe the best example of where this can lead. Pretty frighteningly large percentages, minority percentages of Americans say things like violence against the opposition party is justified. Again, it's a minority, very definite minority, but still it's been growing some. I would not want to live next door to people who belong to the opposition party. I wouldn't want my child to marry somebody from the opposition party. So, that's where we are today. And it's not as if Donald Trump is trying to ameliorate it. No, he's encouraging affective polarization through his extremist, blood-curdling rhetoric out there. This is part of the reason why he was able to win on both occasions, mobilizing his base. It's not a very large base. It's at most just the narrowest possible majority, like in 2024. But, these are intense people. So, again, there's no end to this that I can see.
Yeah.
In terms of what you asked about what can be done about polarization, I'm very pessimistic, anything significant. I think probably the most viable of all the possibilities would have to be tinkering with the primary system. And do you know about the top two primary system that's used now in Washington State and California?
Is it, you could label one candidate as this is my first favorite and the
That's the
second one is like
second
my
way of
second
tinkering with the
favorite.
primary system, which also, probably would have at the margin some ameliorative effect. Top two primary, Washington State, California, and then there's a variation called the top four primary system from Alaska. The idea is you have an all-party primary. All the candidates who are seeking like the Senate, they get put on the same ballot. Anybody who wants to can vote. And then the top two finishers, they run off against one another in November. It doesn't matter whether one candidate in the primary has a majority. The top two, they face off. In Alaska, it's the top four who face off in November, which is kind of silly because people end up in third or fourth place at virtually no chance whatsoever in the runoff. But see, this is thought to have at least some effect in increasing the odds of a moderate person being nominated and then elected. The premium is on spreading your net out widely. You got to make it into the top two. So you can't just appeal in the all-party primary, to your own base. You got to appeal to moderates, independents, maybe even moderate members of the opposition party. So that's the main way in which it's supposed to encourage more moderate people being nominated and then elected. And also, some cases, obviously, very strong Democratic area, for example, the two top finishers are going to be both Democrats. And then when they face off, supposedly the guy, who's more moderate has the advantage because he can appeal, she can appeal to moderate members of his or her own party, as well as to independents and moderate members of the opposition party. So that's the way in which top two or top four primary is supposed to work. It's had very marginal returns with regard to the intended purpose. It was thought maybe that once the system became better known in California and Washington, it would have a stronger effect. But so far, again, only at the margins has this made any difference. The other kind of tinkering is rank order voting, or as it's sometimes called, instant runoff voting, IRV. Okay, so IRV or rank order voting, which you could use either in the primary or in the general or in both. You rank order your candidates from number one down to however far down the list you want to go, number 5 or something like that. And then you see whether or not there's any candidate who has a majority of first place votes. If so, that person is elected, or in the case of a primary, nominated. If not, the person who ends up in last place with regard to first place votes gets thrown out, and that person's second place preferences are distributed to the other people who are still alive and standing. They become, in essence, first place votes. And then you see, now does somebody have a majority? If not, then you just continue the process however long it takes. Keep throwing out person at the bottom, redistribute the second place preferences, and in the end, maybe you'll come down to just two people. And by definition, when it's a two-person final case, one of those people will have the majority. So you see, the advantage of this system is there's a premium placed upon getting second place votes. Somebody who might win in terms of first place votes, an extremist who gets like 32%, that person may not have very much appeal to others. The person has a very intense but narrow support. But the person who has a lot of second place votes out there then might prevail, finally, who's more broadly acceptable. And being more broadly acceptable would imply a person who is more moderate than the candidate who ended up in first place initially. There actually was one I think it's a pretty clear-cut case where this worked on behalf of moderation in the Democratic Party. But only one case. There's only one state that uses this system right now, which is Maine. They started in 2018. There was this moderate Democrat, very moderate, in a pretty conservative Maine district, Jared Golden. He ended up, with regard to first place choices, he was running against a Republican incumbent. He was in second place. So he would have lost under a normal system. But then when they redistributed votes from two minor party candidates in third and fourth place, Jared Golden ended up on top and won the seat. So, he's one of the most moderate Democrats, no question, given the district he represents, which went for Trump 3 times in a row now. Then on the other side of things, the incumbent that he knocked off in 2018 was a kind of moderate Republican. So overall, it didn't
Mm-hmm.
have an effect, I guess you could say, in moderating Congress as a whole. But in the Democratic Party, one more definite moderate, was selected. So again, more and more states are thinking seriously about adopting this. Localities like New York City, some of them now have rank order voting. It's probably going to spread, and maybe then once you get past a certain minimum threshold, it'll start having some of the desired consequences. But right now, it's just Maine, just
Why is
Maine.
there opposition? Just
Well,
me now.
Alaska and its
Why is there
runoff uses
opposition?
rank order voting also. Gets more and more complicated. The top four, so they have that at the second level, but not in the primary.
I see. Why haven't more states adopted it? What are the reasons of
Well, one very
opposition
basic kind
behind
of
it?
qualm. It's complicated, and educating voters, the idea of rank ordering, and then what happens, if you don't vote for somebody who is the top choice, the reallocation of your second place preferences. I mean, that can be overcome. It takes experience over time, but in the initial stages, you're going to get a lot of confusion. One thing, however, that's encouraging for rank order voting, colleges very widely use this, like Vassar, for student elections. So more and more people with a college degree, they're pretty comfortable with it. Even when people, though, on a widespread basis, understand what's going on there, takes longer before you can find out who won. I mean, it can get really complicated where, you're throwing out the sixth place candidate and that's not enough. Then you got to throw out fifth place candidate. And so it can take days before you finally know who wins. And,
Okay.
it's already a problem in some cases just because of mail-in ballots, which take longer typically to count, where you don't know who won for days afterwards. In California, where the great majority of people vote mail-in, in recent elections, it's taken sometimes like 2 weeks, in very close contests before you know whether a Democrat or a Republican won. So if you had a combination of, more and more mail-in balloting, there's been a trend in that direction, plus instant runoff voting, it could take even longer than at present.
Is that a problem if it takes just a little bit longer to
Well, as
calculate
far
the
as
votes?
the media are concerned, they hate uncertainty. They want, something right away after the election, like election evening even. But I think, just in general, as far as people, given how extraordinarily important elections have become, the stakes are so much higher than in the past because of the differences between Democrats and Republicans. Knowing who controls the House for 2 years, starting in early January, same thing with regard to the Senate, this kind of uncertainty. So, I mean, that's kind of psychological. If it lasts a tremendously long period of time, where you're going onwards into middle or late December before you know whether the House is going to be Democratic, Republican. I mean, this now will have a practical kind of negative consequence. Just organizing with regard to the committee membership. Is your party the majority or the minority? The majority party, with regard to almost every House and Senate committee, gets a majority of the seats. So just naming people, this is stuff that you got to do, pretty quickly. What happens is that parties in late November, typically, the people who've been elected to the next Congress, they convene in Washington and they make decisions like this: who's to be the party leadership and allocation of committee seats and so forth. So uncertainty as to just the most basic thing of all, the most important thing, which is the majority party. How many seats is each party going to get? The party agenda, what realistically you can achieve. If you're the minority party, you're not going to be able to achieve much of anything in the House and so forth. So some delay, 2 weeks, okay, that's livable. But if you go onwards, again, well into December, then you got a real problem. Because the new Congress, according to law, has to convened for the first time at the beginning of January, like January the 3rd. So that's just, 2 months after the election.
Also, I think something that's often discussed is how much social media nowadays, and maybe even traditional media that often relies on the internet to deliver its articles to the readers, clickbaits, and so on, like information became so much shortened, is one of the growing reasons for that polarization. One statistic I wanted to bring up, that an angry Facebook post about a political issue takes 5 times more engagement than just like a neutral post. Has it been one of the major contributors recently to the
Yeah,
growing
I mean, I would agree with
polarization?
that. So if rather than citing four of the major reasons for polarization, I had gone out to five, then the media would have been the next thing to touch upon. The term that's used is echo chamber, the echo chamber effect. And, you go back like 1960s, 1970s, there were three networks. Television wise, that's where you got your news. And ABC, NBC, CBS, they weren't very different politically. There were a lot of disputes among people who paid attention to this, which was the most conservative of the three, maybe ABC, but if so, marginally. Basically, the television networks were moderate with maybe a little bit of a liberal slant. Newspapers, hard copy newspapers, which varied more than the networks ideologically, but still most of them were kind of moderate. But nowadays, you got thousands of media outlets that you can pay attention to, and you pick and choose. If you want to live in a complete bubble out there and never be assaulted by information out there about politics that disagrees with your preconceptions, it's the easiest thing in the world to behave that way. So, the idea is echo chamber, that your preconceptions on politics get reinforced when you're picking and choosing media that agree with yourself. And it goes even further in some cases, not just the reinforcement, but sometimes you come to see yourself as being kind of a wishy-washy moderate. I mean, in reality, you hold some extreme views, but then you start listening to some of these commentators, some of these talk show hosts, Hannity, Levin, and so forth. And, they're putting forth views that are even more extreme than anything you ever came up with on your own, and the guests they have as well, and the people who phone in. And so you start thinking to yourself, I mean, yeah, I better move even further out in that direction. But that's widely considered to be yet another one of these reasons. There have been just all kinds of experiments done by social scientists on the echo chamber effect. I'm not an expert on this literature, but I do remember one big time study being done maybe 7, 8 years ago, something like that, where people who were paid to participate, they were made to listen to media, or if not listen to click with regard to websites that was contrary to their own preconceptions. And would this make them more moderate, move towards the center if they had that exposure, to the other point of view? And the conclusion was no, it didn't work. If anything, it might have even reinforced them more, resistance to those kind of contrary messages. But that's only one from among many, many studies, a lot of which I'm unfamiliar with. But at least in the conventional wisdom, the echo chamber effect is an important reason for polarization.
If we keep getting more and more polarized as a society, are we just going to end up with populist leaders pretty much
Yeah, well, I mean,
forever?
it obviously relates to populism and Donald Trump's style of populism. There is a real question out there whether MAGA republicanism can survive Donald Trump, because so much of his appeal, is personal. This grievance kind of thing, attacks on me, or not just attacks on me, they're an attack on all of you out there. And I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I would say, for the most part, MAGA republicanism will survive under the auspices, of obviously Vance. Vance is a kind of articulate version of Donald Trump, but he's certainly playing the game pretty well. On the Democratic side, you don't have the same kind of strength of populism. But a guy who's been mentioned, and when I read this, I just think this is ludicrous. I don't know, maybe I'm being overly cynical about this, but Stephen Smith. Stephen Smith is a
No.
sportcaster, I think on ESPN. I mean, he does sports. He's one of the most popular sportscasters, but he's been very politically oriented, and certainly he comments an awful lot on the current political scene. He's on the left, and he's coming across as strongly populist. So there is some talk out there of Stephen Smith being nominated for the Democratic candidate for president in 2028. Ludicrous, insane. I mean, he's smart, he's articulate, but he hasn't any real involvement in the world of politics. If the Democrats actually resort to that, oh man, I think I may stop being a political scientist. Seriously, J.D. Vance versus Stephen Smith. Well, that's it for my voting behavior. But again, Smith, he follows politics, and I wouldn't describe him as being demagogic like Donald Trump. The idea of nominating somebody, who's completely divorced from ever holding any kind of a government position, that to me is very offensive. I mean, that's Donald Trump, only president in American history who had no background with regard to working for government or being a member of the military.
Mhm. Um, Another question I had, which always surprised me, is that people that would need federal help and in general government help for their livelihoods, or states that most rely on federal funds for education, they often vote against their own interests. How is that possible?
Well, there's a book, I can't remember the author, What's the Matter with Kansas? I may have that title slightly wrong, which came out probably it's now been 15 or 20 years ago. This was a liberal guy who wrote it. He wasn't a political scientist, but he's singling out Kansas in this regard. I mean, you got a lot of people out there who are not doing very well as farmers and so forth. And why is it that Kansas, not simply a traditional Republican state, but moving further and further in that direction, not just towards republicanism, but towards a very conservative kind of brand of republicanism, conservatism. The general feeling out there is because social issues are trumping economic issues. And, in part, these social issues being demagogued, in particular by Republicans out there. People in rural states, relatively small population states, the Dakotas would be a good example of that. More and more they come to see as being the most important thing, things like gay rights, transgenders invading bathrooms of their daughters, et cetera, et cetera. So coming to see that it's more important than their own economic interests, and economically, not seeing the Democratic Party is doing very much for themselves. Democratic Party moving onwards, more and more focus on social issues, but on the left wing side of things. The Dakotas used to actually, if anything, when it came to voting for Congress, like for the Senate, they were more Democratic than Republican. And it wasn't that far in the past, up to 15 or 20 years ago. Dakotas, again, more Democrats would be elected, at least to the Senate, than Republicans. And, now it's hopeless. The Dakotas, Democrats, they put up candidates for congressional office, but they don't have a ghost of a chance of winning. So that's a very good example. The rural rage phenomenon. Sometimes it's what's referred to. There's a book actually I used in a class past term, White Rural Rage, which talks about people particularly in scarcely populated areas of the country and the social issues. The social issues. At the same time, they don't see Democrats as being particularly concerned with them with their own economic welfare. The division, with regard to
Yeah.
polarization between urban areas and rural areas, that's one of the major elements of polarization today. Certainly, not a let up at all with regards to the 2024 election. Uh, it was thought in the Democratic Party that by nominating Tim Walz for vice president, maybe the Democrats could at least a little bit overcome this. He grew up in small towns in Nebraska. When he was in the House of Representatives, he represented a pretty rural district, Minnesota. He spoke very plain, very,
Mm-hmm.
very, very plain spoken. He spoke like ordinary people and all that. So I thought maybe this was a way of overcoming this growing urban and suburban versus rural split. But the evidences didn't make any difference whatsoever. Maybe in the other direction, even though rural areas became more Republican in 2024, urban areas actually moved a little bit towards the Republican Party. The appeal of Donald Trump to people who were non-college educated in states like New Jersey and New York and so forth. So the Democratic great big majorities that are typical of those states, they didn't quite extend to the same extent. But I mean, basically, the overall pattern is urban, suburban versus rural, and that's widening out there because of the social issues. Demagoguing
We
of the
also
social
saw,
issues by Republicans.
yeah. In this election, we also saw the Latin American vote come more to the right than ever before. Why do you think
Well,
that
still, I mean,
happened?
Latino Americans, still to a pretty fair extent are Democratic rather than Republican. But, you're right, obviously. This was one of the notable phenomena in the election that they did go more for Trump than they had in the past to a pretty fair extent. One reason is because, those who are Latino who entered the United States legally, they don't think it's fair that people who cross the border illegally should right away start enjoying the benefits of getting a job in the United States, etc. Also, to some extent, those who are Latinos are heavily Catholic, and as a consequence, a lot of them, just on religious grounds, very offended by abortion. So they're socially conservative in
Mm-hmm.
that regard. Entrepreneurial kind of attitudes out there. They admire Donald Trump, who supposedly is a self-made man, made himself through hard work and not political, but economic acumen into a tremendously wealthy billionaire, that sort of thing, even though, in fact, he was staked to the tune of tens of millions of dollars by his father to get him started. So those are the three things that come to mind why there is this movement. But again, it's important not to make too much of it. Still, as I said, Latinos are more Democratic than Republican. And it is possible
Mm-hmm.
that, with Trump out of the picture, like in 2028, some of the appeal of the Republican Party to Latinos is because of Donald Trump, the self-made man, that kind of thing. So that could fade away.
Yeah. Some of Twitter opinions that I read is that potentially Democrats lost in the 2024 election because of the transgender agenda that they had, and maybe especially in the like 30-year-old male vote.
Well,
Do you think if they were more, I guess, like not taking on such far left agenda, they would have had a better chance? Or would have they lost a lot of their base
Well,
in
I
that
touched on this idea.
situation?
It's always the case after you lose an election, even when you lose narrowly, as the Democrats did in 2024. The recriminations get thrown out from both sides. So, clearly, more moderate Democrats out there. I don't think anybody would make the claim that the transgender issue was one of the most important reasons for Donald Trump winning. But still, it's a close election, and the three so-called blue wall states that the Democrats lost, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, if you add on other kinds of social issues to the transgender controversy, just maybe they could have gone Democratic. I don't think so, but you do see some movement on the part of big name Democrats out there, to try to move the party away from this idea, of transgender females should be able to play on female sports teams. And most notably, Gavin Newsom, governor, who's considered a liberal Democratic governor of California, and who's very ambitious. Probably he'll run for president in 2028. He's now come out and flatly said that transgender females should not be able to participate on women's sports teams. It's unfair. And this is a really leading figure out there, so that got a great amount of media attention. Before Gavin Newsom, this was right after the election, 2024. There's this Democrat, fairly moderate House member called Seth Moulton in Massachusetts. And of course, Massachusetts is a bright blue state. He said much the same thing. His statement in particular said, I have this daughter, I guess the daughter on the soccer team, and I don't want her to be run over by a great big transgender female. Be hurt badly. Trump, during his joint address to Congress 2 Tuesdays ago, you may remember if you saw that, he pointed out one of the guests that he had invited. You invited guests out there, and then you use it.
The swimmer.
Say it again.
Did he invite the swimmer?
Well, it was a
girl? I don't
volleyball
remember
player.
her name.
More and more, you invite these people, you use them as props. So she was sitting right next to the First Lady, Melania, and Trump, recognized her and said she got a really serious brain injury because a transgender member of the opposing volleyball team spiked the ball right into her forehead. She had to be operated on and so forth. So he was playing up the issue. But more moderate Democrats, in general, they at least say, just forget about that. Forget about, in particular, the idea transgender should be able to participate on women's sports teams. Basically, just ignore the issue and hope it'll go away. But that causes great offense with regard to the progressives in the Democratic Party. Again, I don't think
How
in
much,
2024 that this was an issue that carried much weight.
if the Democratic Party were to move away a little bit from some of the far left ideas, how much should they be worried about losing their base versus maybe hoping for vote for us, at least we're not Republicans argument with their base in
I think,
particular?
assuming that you get J.D. Vance in 2028, who's trying to be a kind of more articulate clone of Donald Trump, you get an awful lot of grumbling out there, a lot of threats on the part of progressives how they're going to sit out the election or they're going to vote third party, like for a Green Party candidate. But I think in the end, when push comes to shove, the horror of another 4 years of republicanism, MAGA republicanism, is going to make the great majority of these people swallow hard and vote Democratic. They won't be enthusiastic about it, and some contributors out there on the far left of the Democratic Party who are well-heeled may not contribute as much. But I think in the end, in an era of intense polarization, people who identify as Democrats are going to vote Democratic.
I guess last question in terms of what else Democrats could have done. I think a big part right now is social media and that more personal communication with your voter that I think Trump actually really skillfully utilized. Do you think for Democrats to sort of pursue next elections, they have to get the TikTok accounts and get out there and communicate
Well, I
with
think
their
they
voters
will.
directly?
In terms of how important the relative neglect of that was in the 2024 outcome, I'm somewhat skeptical. In particular, though, those who are making this claim, among the myriad of reasons why Kamala Harris lost, They say, she didn't go on Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan would have had her on his program, even though ideologically he's way off to the right. But what the Democrats weren't sensitive enough to is how many, in particular, of your young, non-college educated males, they just love Joe Rogan. I mean, Joe Rogan speaks their language. So at least if she entered into the lion's den out there, at least exposed herself to potentially politically precarious program. At least her courage out there would have impressed them, and the fact that she's recognizing Joe Rogan as having an enormous audience, well, that's been alleged. But I think in general the Democrats, more by way of sensitivity to podcasts, Joe Rogan, and other kinds of social media like that for 2026 and in particular 2028.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Why do you think Kamala Harris was so reluctant to, well, Donald Trump went crazy with all kinds of media appearances, and I think there was such a big criticism that she never spoke without kind of a speech being pre-written.
Yeah, that was the myriad of factors again that you can put your finger on that made her lose. She seemed to be hiding from the media. I mean, in part, obviously, it's because suddenly, I can't remember the exact number of days before the election, when she announced for president following Biden's withdrawal, it was something like 107 days. Still, that's not very long when it comes to what is involved in a presidential campaign nowadays. She wasn't up to steam. They were hiding her from the media in part because she had to rehearse her positions on issues. She had to develop positions on issues for the first time. And there's also a school of thought that just says that Kamala Harris wasn't very good on issues, period. She was kind of, just sort of a hollow candidate out there, which I think is a gross exaggeration. Vice presidents so often come across as being, just meaningless props to the president. But still, there was this feeling that maybe Kamala Harris wasn't the best vice president, wasn't solid enough on issues to begin with. But I think mainly it's because, they wanted her to get up to steam and they were afraid she would be embarrassed if prematurely she made these appearances. And of course, the reality is 2 times in a row, when she was asked directly about whether she would differ from Joe Biden, the American public clearly wanted change. Joe Biden was unpopular. So she had these first two opportunities, at least, in some kind of not horribly important ways, just to say something different that you're going to do, and she refused. The third time around, in a very, very innocuous kind of way, symbolically, maybe she'd be different. But with regard to concrete policies, she couldn't identify how she would be the change. I mean, in part, it might just be Kamala Harris. It's also in part because if you differentiate yourself, try to differentiate yourself too much from your boss, then the party loyalists are going to resent that. But, again, it's always a myriad of explanations when you lose. And at some point in the very near future, you can get some hardcore political science studies which will do justice to this issue that I can't do right now. Mainly right now, what we have to rely upon are kind of quick and dirty verdicts, the world of journalism, rather than hardcore statistical analysis. Some of that is occurring, but it's going to take a long time before you come to a more definitive judgment.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I think I got a lot of answers to my questions. I found this conversation very interesting. My next conversation for this podcast is also going to be with a Vassar professor, Sarah Perlman. She studies, yes, she studies Latin America economy and also the immigration issue specifically within the United States. That's what we're going to focus on. I was wondering if you had a question for her, and I will ask that during our next
to do with
episode if you
policy
would like
towards
to
Latin
participate.
America of the United States.
We're going to talk more about Latin American immigrants in the United States and the immigration
Well, and
policy.
this is an area I know very, very little about, but the Panama Canal and how other Latin American countries above and beyond Panama are reacting to what Trump is doing. I think it was just yesterday
Mm-hmm.
where supposedly now various policy options are being developed, one of which was military force to take over the Panama Canal. Extraordinary, just horrendous. But obviously, the hope of the administration is it's not going to require military takeover. It's rather intimidation, and the Panamanians will give in and let the U.S. at least manage the canal, if not openly claim it as its territory. But this is gunboat diplomacy, and what Carter did in giving the Panamanians control over the operation of the canal and giving up the U.S. canal zone, that was a very positive development with regard to how these Latin American countries viewed the United States. Well, that's about the only thing that occurs to me right now. But
No, that's a good question.
it's absolutely beyond the boundaries of what people thought was going to happen during the election period. I mean, obviously, Greenland and this absolute idiocy about Canada, which is the most of all these kind of flexing of American muscles and threats of occupation. Canada is the worst of them all. Insanity. But Greenland, Panama Canal, and then Gaza. Again, it's just you would never expect that he would go to that extent during the campaign, as crazy as his campaign was in 24.
Yeah. Is the War Powers Resolution of 1973, that still kind of keeps the ability to sort of go to war with somebody with the legislative branch? Or is it possible if I don't know, Trump decides to go for one of these
Yeah.
operations, is it possible for him to
Well,
initiate
the War
that?
Powers Act still exists, but it's viewed by almost everybody as being a total failure. It was a sincere effort by Congress to try to regain at least something in the realm of war powers. What the War Powers Act allows is just being kind of general. President can wage war on his own volition for up to 90 days. Congress can't do anything about this for 90 days. And, when it comes to something like taking over the Panama Canal, it's not exactly going to be a war that takes a year or 2 years. No, just a day or so. After 90
Uh-huh.
days, again, skipping over the details, theoretically, it's possible for Congress to say to the president, you got to withdraw the troops, bring them back home. But the War Powers Act, it's never been used in that fashion. Basically, Congress ignores it. To repeat, though, it was sincere on the part of members of Congress because of the Vietnam War, waged by presidents on their own volition. So supposedly it would stop future Vietnams. But basically, it
Mm-hmm.
exists on paper, and that's it. So with regard to these threats of Donald Trump, I don't think there's any relevance whatsoever of this law. And he'll be
I
cheerlead
see.
by members of Congress, at least on the Republican side, if he ever gets to the point of military intervention against the canal. Just well, in terms of how to alienate Latin American nations, there's nothing that comes to mind that would be a more gross kind of offense in their minds.
Yeah. Well, I guess we could just hope that that was one of the, I don't know, threats that won't come to fruition.